Within the shelter of the Blue Ridge and the Great Smoky Mountains of western North Carolina, a beautiful city has arisen. Asheville, North Carolina is the county seat of Buncombe County. But Buncombe County has not always been like this. It used to include all the area now labeled Yancey, Madison, Haywood, Henderson, Transylvania, Jackson, Swain, Macon, Clay, Graham, and Cherokee counties. A drive through Buncombe County will take you on roads labeled Patton Avenue, Gudger Road, Gashes Creek Road, Case Cove Road. Where did these names come from, and why are they used? To learn the answers, you'll need to know something of its beginnings. The Cherokee Indians who live here today are the descendants of a great many Indian people whose territory once extended into the present states of South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia. But before the Cherokees lived here, they were part of a big group who lived up north, and were only one of many groups, speaking many different languages, having differing opinions from their neighbors, and often having to fight bloody wars to protect or expand their territories. Across the Atlantic Ocean, paler-skinned people in Europe lived in different countries, spoke different languages, had differing opinions from their neighbors, and often had to fight bloody wars to protect or expand their territories. Once the people in Europe learned that there was a lot of land in what they called the New World, many of them viewed it as an opportunity to start over, to be able to acquire land and to make their own decisions about how to live and how to worship their God. As the political and religious wars increased, many thousands of people decided to leave Europe, many of them in organized religious groups, such as the French Huguenots and the German Lutherans. They sailed down the Rhine River to the ocean port of Rotterdam, and from there took ship to the New World, oftentimes landing at the Pennsylvania port city of Philadelphia. There was also a steady stream of immigrants from Ireland. All of them had had troubles in their own countries that they wanted to forget. Two acts of the British Parliament caused a lot of Scottish people to leave Northern Ireland. One was the Woollands Act of 1699, which decreed that the Scottish settlers in Northern Ireland, known as the Ulster Scots, could only sell their woolen goods to markets in England and Wales at prices that England controlled. This closed their markets all over Ireland and other countries in Europe and destroyed their woolen trade, so they couldn't earn a decent living anymore. And then Parliament passed the Test Act of 1704, which tried to force all the Presbyterian Protestants to join the Church of England. Because of these acts, and starting about 1717, many families decided to move to America. They arrived in Philadelphia and first lived in and around Chester, Lancaster, York, and Adams counties, spread out from the greater Philadelphia area. But there was another group of Scottish immigrants straight from Scotland, made up of both Highlanders and Lowlanders. Most of them had tried to help the man they called Bonnie Prince Charlie take back the throne of England. They felt that he was the rightful heir to the throne that had been taken away from his father. In 1746, a terrible bloody battle was fought at Culloden Moor in Scotland. The Scots were badly defeated by the English, and many of those who survived the actual battle were given a choice: either be beheaded right there and then, or take a strong oath of allegiance to the King of England and get on a ship going to the colonies in America. At this point, the Scots were glad to get as far away from England as they could. Most of them were sent to Charleston in the Carolinas, and many stayed there near the East Coast. But by the middle of the 1700s, the new Scots-Irish and German immigrants found that both Pennsylvania and eastern South Carolina were fairly well settled, with the best lands taken up by people who had come earlier. Then, too, by 1756, England and France began fighting another war over a lot of things, but partly over who was going to own all of the New World. Part of the war was fought here in America, particularly in the western part of Pennsylvania and Virginia. So there was war between the English colonists near the coast and the French with their Indian allies, who had moved behind them down along the Mississippi and north of them along the Great Lakes and down the St. Lawrence River to the ocean. The English colonists living in Virginia were afraid the Indians would attack them, so they decided to pass a new law. They said that other Protestants wouldn't have to pay taxes for the Church of England for 10 years if they would settle in the western part of Virginia. Maryland wanted a buffer zone along their western frontier, too, so its governor made good offers to attract and keep settlers in this area. This made Middle and Western Virginia and Maryland much more attractive to the Lutheran Germans and the Presbyterian Scots-Irish. If you look at the names of the landowners in both places, you'll find many names that sound just like North Carolina names. That's because about 10 years later, when their sons and daughters needed more land, they moved on down through the valleys following what became known as the Great Wagon Road. This ran from Philadelphia down into North Carolina, reaching about to Salisbury in Rowan County. Rowan was a huge county, and many people moved into the western part where land was still available. Then they were having to go so far to the Rowan courthouse to transact their legal business that they asked the English-controlled North Carolina government to cut off sections of the land to be new counties with their own county courthouses near their homes. The newcomers from Europe were getting the land they had wanted, but at the same time they found themselves having to fight against both the French and the Indians, mainly up through Tennessee between 1755 and 1763. Finally, by 1763, the English won its war against France, and the French had to move out of the Mississippi area, and also lost control of the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes area. One river in western North Carolina was a boundary between the English and French claimed territory and came to be called the French Broad River. But just because the French were gone, the Indians didn't stop wanting to keep Europeans from moving onto their hunting grounds. They would attack the European settlers' cabins and set them on fire and kill the people. In turn, the settlers would kill the Indians, burn their villages, and ruin their crops. Everyone lived with fear from day to day. Back in England, the war against the French had been expensive. The king and the lawmakers in Parliament needed to raise extra money. They decided to raise the money by taxing their colonists in America, even though they wouldn't allow the colonies to send any representatives to Parliament. The colonies didn't like being told what to do and how much they had to pay without having some say in how they were going to be governed. So trouble with England started up in Massachusetts. A protest meeting in Boston ended in a shooting, and both colonists and British soldiers were killed in what came to be called the Boston Massacre. Each of the 13 colonies sent delegates to a Continental Congress in Philadelphia, where it was decided that the colonists deserved to be treated fairly and given the same rights as all other English citizens. When these first demands were refused by the king and Parliament, representatives met again in a second Continental Congress in 1776, and it was decided that the 13 colonies would join together. From here on, they would be independent of British rule. They named their new country the United States of America. But not everyone in the American colonies wanted to break away from England. Some, like the Highland Scots in North and South Carolina, knew from first-hand experience what it was like to fight the very strong British Army, and to lose. The penalty for treason was death by hanging. They had taken strong oaths of allegiance to the king, and didn't dare break them. Some settlers had fought against the Indians as British soldiers here in America, and they too had taken oaths of allegiance to the king. But times had suddenly changed. America wasn't British anymore. Thousands and thousands of dissatisfied Europeans here were glad to swear allegiance to their new country. Others recruited hard for friends and neighbors to join the British forces to help put down the rebellion. So now the settlers not only had to guard against Indians and the British troops, but their families and neighbors as well. People who remained loyal to England were called Tories or Loyalists, while the ones who wanted a new country were called Patriots. The fighting that started in Massachusetts at Lexington and Bunker Hill soon spread all over the country. About 4 years later, in 1780, a major battle was fought in the Carolinas at Kings Mountain that was the decisive victory over the British. The Over-Mountain men from upper western part of North Carolina decided to attack Colonel Patrick Ferguson's army, which had retreated to Kings Mountain. On the 7th of October, 1780, after being in the saddle 30 hours without rest and drenched by a heavy rain, these men approached Kings Mountain. Joseph McDowell, John Sevier, and Joseph Winston led the right wing. William Campbell and Isaac Shelby led the center, and the left wing was commanded by Benjamin Cleveland and James Williams. The plan of battle was to surround the mountain and attack each side simultaneously. The men in the center began the attack by marching boldly up the mountain. They reached the top of the mountain and drove the enemy before them to the western end, where Cleveland and Williams had been contending with another part of their line. Campbell now reached the summit and bombarded the enemy with a deadly fire. Attacked on all sides, with the circle becoming smaller and smaller, Ferguson tried to break through the lines and was shot dead in the attempt. The battle was soon over. Tory prisoners were taken captive by the Patriots, who immediately started back towards Gilberttown in Rutherford County. There they camped for the night and held a hasty midnight trial of the Tory leaders. The country was no longer a British colony, so now the Tories had become the enemies of the state, subject to hanging for treason. Colonel Ambrose Mills and 8 other prominent leaders were hanged before the decision was made to stop the killing, and the army continued its trek home to the mountains. The Patriots didn't know it at the time, but this was the turning point in the Revolutionary War. In the meantime, life went on in North Carolina west of Rowan. Settlers were continuing to build new homes and lives for themselves in all of these areas. Some of these were in the area of what became Burke County in 1777, with a courthouse in Morgantown, and some were in the new Rutherford County, which was established in 1778 with a courthouse at Rutherfordton. New treaties with the Indians had opened up far more land to the west, as far as the French Broad River and a little farther, and this land was divided up and sold to large land speculators, who in turn would sell pieces of it to small farmers. Many people had crossed through several gaps in the mountains and come into the far western area of Burke and Rutherford counties during the 1780s. Saluda Gap and Cooper Gap led people into what would later become Henderson County. These were the Coopers, the Gudgers, the Cases, the Moody's. The Swannanoa Gap brought people along the Swannanoa River and up into Bee Tree Creek to the area that we know as Black Mountain. Then they continued along the Swannanoa River to what we know as Biltmore. These were the Davidsons, the Alexanders, the Smiths, the McDowells. Some of these came by way of Reams Creek and settled in what became known as Weaverville and the Beaver Dam area. These were the Weavers, the Biffles, the Killians, the Bairds, the Vances. As shown in this oil painting by Elizabeth Kramer McClure, the settlers came with what few things they could load into wagons and the few sheep and hogs they could drive before them. They built small cabins for their homes as quickly as they could and planted corn and whatever other vegetable seeds they had in and around the tree stumps. They made their furniture out of wood left over from the building of the cabins. The men knew how to build looms, and the women knew how to spin wool into thread so they could weave cloth for blankets and clothing. We have a long list of these people who were in the 1790 census records of Burke and Rutherford counties, but living in these mountains. 1791, many of these settlers petitioned to have a new county set off with a new courthouse. The name was chosen to honor Revolutionary War hero Colonel Edward Buncombe. Buncombe County was originally so large, it was soon nicknamed the State of Buncombe. As soon as they had created Buncombe County, the settlers took an official place in the governing of the new state of North Carolina and elected a senator and members of the House of Commons. The first courthouse was built just about where Patton Avenue comes into Pack Square today. John Brown from Pennsylvania came through here in 1795 to buy land as an investment for himself and other speculators. They could foresee that there would be a great demand for it, and they could sell it in small sections and make money. At one point, one of these investors, Tench Cox of Philadelphia, owned over half the land in Rutherford County. You can see his name on the Tench Cox building in Pritchard Square in Asheville to this day. Another investor, John Britton, bought land in what is now downtown Asheville, and he sold lots to the early business people who erected small buildings near his grist mill. George Swain set up a business to make hats. Silas McDowell opened a tailoring shop. James Patton and his family served meals to the travelers, and Philip Smith made saddles and hats, as well as shoes for both men and horses. This place, called Buncombe Courthouse, had become a little town, but the first business owners didn't live in town at first. At the end of the day, they locked up their business cabins and went home to their farms. The name of the town was changed from Buncombe Courthouse to Morristown, but that wasn't very popular. So when it was officially incorporated, the name was changed to Asheville to honor Governor Samuel Ashe. Early circuit-riding ministers from the Presbyterian, Methodist, and Baptist churches followed the settlers into North Carolina and all through the Burke, Rutherford, and Buncombe counties area. The First Presbyterian Church on Peachtree Road in Swannanoa grew out of the congregation first organized in the 1790s by the Alexander and Davidson families. The Asbury Memorial United Methodist Church on Beaver Dam Road in North Asheville was originally organized in 1801 in Daniel Killian's home. This building stands today on land donated by the Killian family, and which holds the distinction of never having been bought or sold, having been part of Daniel Killian's original land grant from the British government. An Indian trail came to be known as the Drover's Road and was used not only by mountain farmers to drive their hogs and turkeys from Buncombe County to markets in South Carolina, but also became a major postal route. George Swain, whose roots trace back to England through Rhode Island, Nantucket Island, and New Hampshire, became the first postmaster in 1801. That same year, his wife gave birth to David Lowry Swain, who became the first governor of North Carolina born in this western area. By 1806, Asheville had become the distribution point for mail going both north to Tennessee and south to Greenville and Georgia and east to Charleston, and so its place in the commercial life of western North Carolina became assured. The census records for 1790 for the area that became Buncombe County in 1791 list the names of 293 heads of households, but these records tell us that there were a total of 1,771 persons living in these households. Over 1,200 of them were women and children under 16, plus there were 73 people listed as slaves. They all came with the dream of having a good home, and all deserve the credit for working together to make it come true. Many of the families have been described in 2 volumes of The Heritage of Old Buncombe County, produced by the Old Buncombe County Genealogical Society. Genealogical societies here and all over North Carolina have compiled books containing the stories of most of the families who ventured to leave their homes in Europe, made the dangerous ocean crossing to America, and eventually managed to find themselves here in Buncombe County. The museums in this area, like the David Vance birthplace in Buncombe County, and the Johnson Farm in Henderson County, can show you samples of the early farms they developed. The Folk Arts Center, with its Highland crafts, show us the skills and techniques that used to be used for producing clothing, dishes, and furniture for everyday living. As the people worked, the mountains around them stood silent as they had for thousands of years. As the European settlers poured in, Buncombe County grew and expanded, and more counties were created to fill their needs until western North Carolina became what it is today. We look around today and see beautiful cities and towns, prosperous businesses and homes. The names of the people listed in each county may be different as more and more people have been attracted to these mountains to live and retire, but as we drive around the county, we see reminders of these early settlers every day. They are still with us, and we continue to remember and thank them for the parts they played in our Buncombe beginnings.